So hi everyone, welcome to this third session of the afternoon, and Bratislav is going to introduce Amy, so please take it away, Bratislav.
Hello everybody, welcome to the next session. It's really a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Amy Kuceyeski, who is an associate professor at Cornell. Her work has really been diverse and very exciting for me personally, because she's covered a lot of the topics that I think are really super interesting in our field. Everything from models of diffusion to predict neurodegeneration, and more recently, structure-function relationships, how localized they are, how they change and configure over the lifespan, sex differences in the organization of connectomes, really just a very complete research program. And today she will give us a talk on a topic that I believe she just put out as a preprint today. So you are fortunate in the sense that you're going to get the most up-to-date version of this. So thank you so much, Amy, for joining us. Sorry about the delay. Really looking forward to your talk.
Great. Thank you so much, Bratislav. So it's my pleasure to be here today. Thank you to the organizers, Bratislav and Scott, for inviting me to come give a talk in this fantastic speaker lineup. So it was too bad that I had to leave early Emma's talk, because she was talking about some things that are relevant to the work that I'm going to be discussing today. So I guess she already covered some of it for me. But as Bratislav said, this is actually work that I'm going to be presenting today. It was just put on bioRxiv yesterday. So this is work that's been driven by a PhD student of mine, Parker Singleton. And he is actually a former PhD chemistry student who has turned neuro. So we brought him to the dark side. But he's still interested in chemistry, although it's the chemistry in how pharmacological agents can be used to modify brain connectivity and brain activity. And so, yeah, so today we'll be discussing the work that he's been doing in my labs for the last year or so. Okay, so let me discuss first this rebus hypothesis. So the rebus hypothesis was first proposed by Robin Carhart-Harris, one of our collaborators, and Carl Friston in 2019. And what this states is that your brain has this sensory input that's coming into the system, and it's derived from things like visual input or auditory input. And you also have your prior beliefs about what that sensory input should be. So you have these top-down predictions about what the sensory input should entail and what it should contain. So one example of this is that you have a prior belief that a wall should not move. And so if a sensory input has some error or some noise in it that kind of indicates that the wall moves, your prior will override it and say that wall is not moving. And so that's how they propose that your brain works, is basically like a Bayesian machine, where you have these prior beliefs that are filtering your incoming sensory input. So what they state is that in psychedelics, what happens is these prior beliefs actually relax. And so now your brain has more weight applied to the sensory input that's coming in. And these prior beliefs no longer dominate the interpretation of that sensory input. And it allows more of that sensory input to flow and dominate the activity and the perception. And so that's one of the hypotheses why you have altered perception when you take psychedelics. And now what this means on the energy landscape in the brain is that you no longer have these strict priors that cause these tall mountains and low valleys that kind of restrict brain activity flow within the brain. And now we have a flattening of the landscape. So the priors are relaxed, they become wider and flatter, and your brain is allowed to move more freely through its activity landscape. So that's the hypothesis. And my slide is not advancing. Okay, my slide advanced, hold on. Okay. All right, so Parker and I when we discussed what we wanted to do for his thesis, he was really interested in psychedelics and how they might change brain activity. And so we were very interested in using an approach that was first proposed by Danny Bassett's group. Eli Kornblath is the first author. So this paper was a really exciting and very interesting paper that uses network control theory to quantify brain dynamics. And again, I'm very excited that Emma just talked about this, because some of my job is done. But essentially, network control theory says that you have different states of brain activity that can possibly occur. And the structural connectome is the thing that allows the activity to flow through allows the activity to flow through the network of the brain and get from one state to another. And so they were able to actually quantify, for example, the amount of energy it takes to get from one state to another, given that they have the structural connectome as the backbone for activity flow. And what they showed, some interesting results. One of them was that the shifts in some of these dynamics were related to working memory. So one example result that they had was that people who more often transition from a certain brain state to another, in this case was low amplitude visual activity to high amplitude default mode network activity, actually had worse working memory performance than those that more often transition from this same state to a frontal parietal network state. And so they seemed that there's something about the brain dynamics that might be reflected in performance of a working memory task. They also showed that the energy required to get from one state to another actually changes with age. So they did a cross-sectional analysis, and they showed that as a person ages, the amount of energy needed to transition from any brain state to the default mode network state actually reduced. So there seems to be some age-related effects on the energy required to transition between states, quantified using this network control theory. So we decided that this was a really good approach to use to test the rebus hypothesis. So again, we'll restate the hypothesis is that under placebo conditions, you have a certain amount of energy that it takes to get from any brain activity state to another. And you can think of this as like a high mountains and low valleys. And the idea is that in the LSD case, these high mountains and low valleys are flattened to more rolling hills and gentle slopes. And the transition energy needed to go from one brain state to another is lower. So we decided to use and apply this network control theory approach and apply it to some data that we got from collaborators. So this is data from Robin Carhart-Harris and Gus Deco and Morten Kringelbach. And so the experimental design for this was that there were 20 people enrolled in the study, and they had 2 visits, and they were about 14 days apart. On one day, the participants were given intravenous placebo, and on the other day, they were given intravenous LSD. And they had 115 minutes between when they were given the injection and before they went into the scanner. The study was single blind for safety reasons, obviously. And then post-infusion, the subjects actually had a brief acclimation period in a mock MRI scanner, so that they weren't kind of overwhelmed when they went in to actually get the MRI. And on each scanning day, there were 2 resting state scans and a scan with music. And these were about 7 minutes and 20 seconds apiece with a TR of 2 seconds. We only used the scans that were at rest because we were more interested in the landscape at rest. So in the end, out of the 20 people who participated in the study, 1 was excluded due to anxiety and 4 were excluded due to excessive motion, which we defined as greater than 15% of the volumes having a mean frame-wise displacement of greater than 0.5 millimeters. So in the end, what we had was 15 subjects. 4 of them were women. They were about 30 years old. And we processed the data in the usual way, using motion correction, bandpass filtering, nuisance regression. We then parcellated the brain into 462 gray matter regions, and we averaged those voxels that were in each region for a regional time series. So in the end, what we had was these time series for your 462 different regions under placebo and under LSD. One important thing to note was that these subjects all had previous experience with a psychedelic, but none had experience in the previous 6 weeks to the study. So then what we did was we combined all of our regional time series into a big pile, both the LSD and the placebo, and we applied a data-driven k-means clustering to identify commonly recurring states of coactivation. And this allows us to do some analysis of brain dynamics. And in our case, what we ended up with were 4 temporally recurring states of brain activity. And the K equals 4 was chosen based on cluster quality metrics. We do some reproducibility with slightly varying this to 5, and we get similar results. But in the K equals 4 case, we actually see that our 4 clusters and our 4 commonly recurring states of activity are more like 2 metastates that consist of substates that are anti-correlated. So you can see on the left what we're calling metastate 1 has low amplitude activity in the somatomotor system and high amplitude activity in the default mode. And the somatomotor negative is the opposite. And so these are radial plots that are the cosine similarity between the cluster centroids and the Yeo functional networks. I should mention that at the beginning. So this tells you how much of each of the functional networks is being represented in the cluster centroids. And then we also have metastate 2, which is more frontal parietal low amplitude activity and high amplitude activity. So you can see here at the bottom, these are the cluster centroids that we found. So the first analysis we did was we looked at each subject's time series, activation time series, and which cluster they were defined in, and we're able to quantify different metrics just based on this time series. So we can see here on the top, we have a certain particular subject's LSD scan and a particular subject's placebo scan. And maybe by eye, you can sort of see there may be something different about these two, but we were able to quantify them using things like fractional occupancy, which is the number of TRs that are assigned to each cluster out of the entire scan. Then dwell time, which is the amount of time spent in that cluster when the brain transitioned to that state. Then we had things like appearance rate, which is the number of times in the per minute that you arrive at that state. And then transition probabilities, which is how likely you are to go from one cluster to another in subsequent time points. So again, these are the 4 clusters we found. And the first thing we found was that fractional occupancy seemed to be higher for the somatomotor-driven state, a dominant state, in LSD, and the frontal parietal dominant state seemed to be less, have lower fractional occupancy in the LSD state. So it seems like LSD is favoring these maybe more bottom-up rather than top-down states. We also see that the fractional occupancy differences are mostly driven by dwell time differences, which is the amount of time spent in each of these clusters once you arrive in that state. And you see actually there's quite a significant decrease in the amount of time spent in this frontal parietal state, which may be considered possibly a more top-down state. So it does seem like LSD is shifting the dynamics and in favor of a somatomotor dominant state rather than a frontal parietal network state. We also looked at transition probabilities, and these agree with our previous findings in the previous slide. And basically what this is showing is that in LSD, the subject was more likely to stay in that somatomotor state and more likely to transition out of that frontal parietal network state. So this diagonal in the transition probability matrix is the persistence probability. So the likelihood that you're going to stay in that state once you're in that state. And so you can see that they're more likely to stay in that somatomotor negative state, significantly so, and more likely to transition out of this frontal parietal network when they arrive in that state. So I'm not sure I need to go over this because Emma did this so beautifully in the previous talk, but let me just get everybody up to speed if somebody missed her talk by chance. So network control theory is essentially describing the brain as a linear system where the structural connectome, the brain activity flows through the network along the structural connectome. And there's also this idea that you can control the activity of the system, possibly using TMS. But here, instead of trying to control the system, what we're doing is assessing the amount of energy that you need to transition between states. And so this is from Braun et al. In 2019. And essentially what this allows us to do, this transition energy calculation, allows us to say how much energy it takes for us to adjust the linear diffusion that we assume that the brain is undergoing to transition to another state. So we have here the linear diffusion applied to our initial state. And we calculate this controllability Gramian, which gives us the amount of energy that it takes for us to complete that state transition, given that we do have diffusion in a linear system with a structural connectome. So this allows us to calculate the amount of energy needed to transition between any two states in our analysis. So there's this T, this time horizon that you're allowing the transition to happen over, and we chose this in a data-driven manner. So we chose this in the same way that they proposed this in its original paper in Kornblath. And this was chosen by finding the T that gave us the maximal correlation between the transition energies and transition probabilities. Well, I guess I should say minimal because it's negative. But the idea there is that if a transition has a lower energy, then it more likely will happen. So those with lower energies also happen more frequently. They have a higher transition probability. So once we had that T, we could go ahead and calculate the amount of energy that it took to transition between each of the states. And we calculated that based on the placebo centroids and calculated it based on the LSD centroids and then compared the two. And we actually see, you can tell this color bar is all negative. And what this is saying is that in the LSD case, the amount of energy that it takes to transition between each pair of states is drastically lowered. So that was a finding that supported the Rebus hypothesis. But we wanted to see by what mechanism do these transition energies decrease. So we had this from PET imaging, we had serotonin receptor maps, and we do know that LSD acts on the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor. And we had some PET imaging that gave us the spatial distribution of this 5-HT2A serotonin receptor map. And we decided that we would test to see if there was something special about the spatial distribution of this 5-HT2A receptor map that allowed the energies to shift down in such a drastic manner. So the analysis that I mentioned before with the transition energies being decreased, that was calculated using uniformly weighted whole brain inputs as a control matrix. And here what we did was we replaced that uniformly weighted whole brain input with a 5-HT2A weighted input. Essentially saying that those regions that have more, that have a higher density of 5-HT2A receptors are also given more control over the system. And our hypothesis was that there was something special about the spatial pattern of these 5-HT2A that would preferentially lower the energy landscape. So this was the result that we had before, where we just looked at the centroids with uniform control inputs, and we see that there's a drastic reduction in energy required to transition between states. Then we took the placebo centroids and we applied the 5-HT2A weighted distribution as a control vector. And we showed that when you consider the distribution of the 5-HT2A weights, you get much lower energy to go between states than you do in the unweighted control matrix case. So we do see that there's something about that. Now we wanted to test to make sure that it wasn't just the distribution of values in the 5-HT2A weighted matrix. So we actually just took the 5-HT2A weighted control matrix and we randomly shuffled their entries. And we see that the true distribution in almost all cases gives us lower energy than a randomly shuffled distribution of 5-HT2A receptors. So this is all pointing to the fact that there's something special about the 5-HT2A receptor. But we do have other receptors to test. So we decided to test the 5-HT1A, 1B, T4, and TT, and we actually see, again, a similar thing. So here were the uniformly weighted control inputs that I had presented earlier. And here's the 5-HT2A control inputs, and then this y-axis is the energy required. So this is the average energy required to transition between states. And we see that the 5-HT2A receptor significantly lowers the energy compared to other receptor density maps and the uniformly weighted control energies. So there's something special about the 5-HT2A receptor map, the actual spatial distribution, that allows a drastic reduction in the energy required to transition between different states of brain activity. We also showed at an individual level that the amount of energy reduction was correlated with the change in dwell times. So you can see here on the y-axis, this is the relative change in energy, and it's all negative, obviously, because we're showing the reductions in energy under LSD. Each of these points is an individual in our study. and on the x-axis, we have the change in dwell times. So you can see that those subjects that had more drastic reductions in their energy required to transition also had shorter dwell times. And that makes sense because if you have less energy to transition, you're more likely to be doing it more often. Similar result for the appearance rate. So the appearance rate increases with decreased energy because the appearance rate, you're arriving more frequently at these new states in time. So we see correlations across individuals as well. So we also wanted to test entropy. So we have these time series of brain states, and we wanted to see if the LSD increased entropy of the information contained in that. And so we found this, this measure called the Lempel-Ziv complexity, and it's the number of different substrings or subwords that are counted as the binary sequence is viewed from left to right. And so we don't have a binary string, but we can binarize it by assigning the two substates to a single hierarchy metastate. So now for each subject, we have two strings of binary numbers, one under LSD and one under placebo, and we're able to calculate the Lempel-Ziv complexity. And here again, we see a correlation at an individual level of the reductions in energy required to transition between states and the amount of entropy. So to summarize, what we found was that LSD favors bottom-up and disfavors these top-down states. There's also a drastic reduction in the transition energy required to go between two brain activity states. So it's kind of this idea of making that mountain into a rolling hill. And so you're able to more easily transition between the states and you're more able to explore the landscape. There seems to be something special about the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor maps. So there's something special about this spatial distribution that allows the landscape to be flattened in the way that we see it happening in fMRI. It also increases the entropy of the brain dynamics. And all of these things support the Rebus hypothesis that prior belief is relaxed under psychedelics. So in thinking about this study, I often think about this classic trope, like, you know, LSD is going to open your mind. Well, more likely it's going to flatten your mind and allow the landscape to be a little bit more explorable and more easily moved between states. So there's been a ton of really recent work looking at treating psychiatric disorders with psychedelics. And I found this really interesting quote. So this person was undergoing therapy with I think psilocybin for PTSD. And he said he felt as if his brain was stuck on what he describes as an automatic circuit, repeating the same negative thoughts like a mantra. Everything I do turns to crap. I really believe that, he recalls. So there's something to this idea of the brain being stuck in a loop, right? So in depression, I have personal experience with depression, and I know someone very close to me who has it, and they felt like they could not exit this negative pattern of thought. And so the idea is then that possibly psychedelics will allow the landscape to flatten and allow that person to escape their negative thought that they cannot otherwise escape. And there's some interesting, really preliminary work that we're doing in our lab showing that in disorders like traumatic brain injury, that the energy landscape actually may be more steep. So this is very preliminary, but it does seem like there's more energy required to transition between states in traumatic brain injury. So, you know, something that might reverse that process could be also potential therapeutic. And you know, I'm sure everybody's been reading about these psychedelics and their treating of different disorders like anorexia nervosa, drug dependency, depression, and other psychiatric conditions. So I think there's a lot of potential here, but obviously we have to be careful. So I just want to wrap up by saying thank you so much to our collaborators who were so generous in just kind of giving us the data when we asked for it. They're fantastic to talk to, and they really helped us to understand and interpret the data. So I wanted to say thank you, and then obviously thank the lab and my funding sources.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy, for such a stimulating talk. We have time for a couple of questions. Maybe I can start with the questions that are in the chat box. I don't know if you can see those, but we have a question from Andrea Kuceyeski. Hi, Andrea. I should mention Andrea is one of our organizers. And she asks, what is the impact of physiological noise, such as cardiac, respiratory, and so on these network dynamics under the LSD manipulation compared to placebo?
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. And we don't have, I don't believe we have any information about the pulse or the breathing or the blood oxygenation level. But I think that would be integral in any future studies, because we do know that there is this there's a potential for physiological noise, right? And especially if there is some pharmacological agent that's shifting that relationship, then it could impact the fMRI response measurements. And I think especially the breathing is kind of interesting, because there was this recent paper by Jonathan Power, I think it just came out last year, where they were showing different patterns of breathing that may be sex specific, like bursting or sighs, that may impact functional connectivity. He was looking specifically at functional connectivity, but I'm sure it also affects the activation and the cluster assignments. Since we weren't looking at functional connectivity, hopefully it's not too much of a problem, but I'm sure that the activation states may shift with the shifts in hemodynamic responses.
Yeah, fantastic. Now we have a question from Julia at the MNI. Hi, Julia. Did you test other dynamic approaches to derive states beyond tuning the cluster numbers, such as, for instance, hidden Markov models and so on?
We did not, but that's a really good idea. That may be our next exploration. But yeah, we have a couple of different approaches that I would like to test. Yeah, and I think that's probably one of them.
Great. If there are any other questions, now is the time to ask them. Otherwise, in the interest of kind of getting back on track, what we'll do is thank Amy one more time. This is a really wonderful talk, really getting at the mechanisms of these pharmacological manipulations that are becoming more and more popular. And we will skip the break and go, oh, there's one more. We'll ask one more, but I will mention this, that we will skip the break and move straight into Kuceyeski's talk after we get Amy to answer this one last question, which is, what is the best way to measure the dynamic change of the landscape as a function of time and metabolism of the drugs?
Oh, that's a good point. So I guess the study was designed in a way such that the peak experience was happening when they were in the scanner. So they were given the LSD and then, or the placebo, and they waited 115 minutes. And I'm sure that's based on some idea about how the body metabolizes LSD and the peak experience that might occur at that time. And so I'm sure that they were considering that. And I would hope that during that kind of 20-minute scan, there wouldn't be too many changes, but it might be interesting actually to look at the maybe the first part of the scan and the last part of the scan to see if you have the same results.
Great. Again, thank you so much, Amy. Thank you all for attending, and looking forward to seeing you in the next session with Kuceyeski again.
Thank you.